How would you like to whistle like that? It's easy. All you need is an ordinary whistle, an average ear for music, and a lot of practice. Let's start with a plain whistle. Now say la, la, la. Notice how your tongue moves up and down. Do it slowly, and then add your whistle. In a short while, if you practice daily, your whistle will sound more like this. And here's a sample of what you can do later. And you can go up and down. With this lesson learned, you can whistle songs and even imitate birds. By producing your la-la whistle at different pitches, you can imitate a robin. Make the same whistle on a lower descending scale, and you have the song of the screech owl. Now for a second type of whistling. You do this one with a tut-tut motion of your tongue. When you add your whistle, you get. After practicing, you have. Perhaps the most difficult of all is the palate whistle. This is accomplished by fluttering the soft palate in the back of your throat, like this. Now add a simple intake whistle to your flutter, and you get. As you practice, many unusual abilities will develop. With a fast la-la whistle, you can produce two notes so closely they sound in harmony. Now with your palate whistle, you can run a whole octave. One of your keenest enjoyments in whistling will come in imitating birds. Here are a few of the scores of calls you can do when you learn the lessons I have given you. The cardinal. The tufted titmouse. And a Carolina wren. And here's the canyon wren. And here are a few birds I won't have to name for you. As you continue to practice, you can try some of the more complicated calls. Here is the meadowlark of western United States. The ruby-crowned kinglet of the high mountains. Now, perhaps the best singer of all, the mockingbird.
This is where the trail begins for you who would shed for a time your city ways and thoughts and experience the tang of wilderness living. Those are a chickadee's cheery notes you hear tinkling down from that towering hemlock. See him up there with his gray topcoat and black cravat? He's upside down. There goes another rhapsody tossed over his fluffy shoulder. What is that beguiling fragrance wafted by the breeze? Is it the pink azalea blooming there by the talkative stream, rushing brimful from melting snows? Or does it come from wildflowers spangled like stars across the mountain meadow? Lift your gaze and glimpse a golden eagle mounting majestically on the winds toward a distant snowy peak. It is a temptation to rush ahead as visions of the scenic marvels and historic treasure lands of the national parks and monuments loom vividly in imagination. But if we may pause here at the beginning of our adventure, there are some things your guide, a former ranger naturalist, would like to say. They are meant to help you get more out of your rewarding adventure ahead. It must already be as plain as the antlers on a moose to even the first visitor to a national park that the one who is to get the most out of his experience will be that person who makes the greatest effort to have his antenna up to catch the full sweep of the new world about him. In short, it will be the one who gets most in tune with nature. To illustrate, in the city the outpouring notes from a robin on a housetop, or a meadowlark lifting a song from a backyard, may go unnoticed to the busy passerby, but the clink of a coin on the sidewalk will arrest his immediate attention. Hearing new sounds takes training. Real listening, the kind that has understanding in it, that both hears and feels, comes not only with practice, but with inspiration. It takes more than a usual ear to detect the faint, high-pitched note of the tiny kinglet up in a giant sequoia. Or the distant drumming of a grouse in the kaibab forest. It takes a sharp eye to spot a fossilized sponge embedded in a limestone layer of Grand Canyon, to glimpse a shaggy marmot darting among ice-burnished granite rocks in the High Sierra, to spot an alligator languorously sleeping in a slough in the Everglades, or to see a dull mountain sheep like a tiny fleck of snow on the slope of Mount McKinley in Alaska. Only a trained and sensitive nose can distinguish between the fragrances of riotous blossoming flowers sprinkled in the green meadows of the Great Smokies, those splashed in the southwest deserts, and others massed in delicate splendor along the down-thrusting glaciers of Mount Rainier. A national parks visit can be for you a carefree vacation, a scientific inquiry, a historical study, a religious experience, or a combination of all these. If what you wish is an outing beyond the reach of television, the office and home routine, the wilderness with its restful vistas, songful streams, and rhythmic quiet awaits. If you seek physical diversion, there are trout streams, trails, horseback riding, boat trips, and skiing in the winter time. There are spectacular wonders that amaze and delight. the flight of millions of bats from Carlsbad Caverns, the lowest point in the United States in Death Valley, a rock larger than Gibraltar in Yosemite, a rainforest in Olympic National Park, a subtropical wilderness in the Everglades. It can be a trip of eager investigation into the fascinating world of nature. What could make natural science come alive for you better than the massive fossil of a Cretaceous crocodile in the deserts of Big Bend, footprints disappearing mysteriously into a 1,000-foot cliff in the depths of Grand Canyon, a blind fish in the inky blackness of Mammoth Cave, or red snow among the peaks of Glacier. For you with an interest in history, there are such places as prehistoric dwellings in the West, Lincoln's log cabin birthplace at Hodgenville, Kentucky, and the parade of Eastern historical sites from Independence Hall with its Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, and Ford's Theater where Lincoln was shot in Washington, to the Gettysburg battlefield in Jamestown, where the revolutionary idea for a new, free nation was born. Symbols of nature, from a snowflake to a star, have always evoked a feeling of closeness in most people to the eternal order of things. I will lift mine eyes up unto the hills, sang the psalmist. It was an appreciation of the inspirational refreshment of nature in its natural state that led to the establishment of the national parks. The national park idea was first broached by explorers of the Washburn-Langford-Doane expedition on a 6-week expedition of discovery in the wilderness of the Yellowstone country of Wyoming in 1870. Around a blazing campfire, as sparks swirled upward against the night sky, conversation had centered on the geysers, churning mud pots, a petrified forest, multicolored canyons, wildlife, and other natural wonders of this area. The possibility of private exploitation was discussed. Then, in a flash of inspiration, Cornelius Hedges, a Montana lawyer, introduced the revolutionary national park idea. It caught fire in the imaginations of the listening men. All thoughts of personal gain from private ownership and financial opportunity were dissipated like the steam of Old Faithful against the sky. In the coming months, congressional and public support was rallied for the new idea, and Yellowstone, with its unparalleled wonders, became the first national park in 1872. It is significant from the National Park Service standpoint that these early explorers did not, in their proposal for preservation, single out individual natural wonders for protection. They wanted the total scene, in all its intrinsic charm of vastness, pristine character, and variety, saved for posterity. They were thinking in terms of the inspirational enjoyment of wilderness. It was the genial, silver-haired Stephen T. Mather, the first National Park Director, who enunciated the idealism of the National Park Service and set the sights for the world's greatest conservation mission. Horace M. Albright, his able successor, and each director since, has followed, within the scope of his talents and vision, and within the climate of public opinion, the original precedents laid down. As Mr. Albright tells the story of the inception of the National Park Service and Mather's connection with it, in the autumn of 1914, Franklin K. Lane, Secretary of the Interior, received some letters of complaints about conditions in the western parks, especially Sequoia. The letters came from Mr. Mather, a Chicago businessman who had been spending his summers in the West since 1905. Finally, Secretary Lane wrote Mr. Mather substantially as follows: Dear Steve, if you don't like the way the parks are being run, come down and run them yourself. Mr. Mather rose to the challenge and accepted in December 1914 the position of assistant to the secretary. After appointing Mr. Mather and wishing him well, Secretary Lane said, "By the way, Steve, I forgot to ask you about your politics." This set the non-political tradition that has characterized subsequent government appointments of the men who have guided the destiny of the national parks. Along with Mr. Mather, there were others, such as Dr. J. Horace McFarland and Frederick Law Olmsted in the American Civic Association, now the American Planning and Civic Association, who began working for the establishment of a National Park Service. Lending a strong hand in the establishment of the national parks were cooperating organizations: the Federation of Western Outdoor Clubs, the Isaac Walton League, the National Parks Association, and the Wilderness Society, which have made major contributions to national parks conservation over a long period of years. Other staunch park promoters and protectors of the national parks include the Sierra Club, National Audubon Society, Garden Club of America, General Federation of Women's Clubs, National Wildlife Federation, American Forestry Association, American Association for the Advancement of Science, American Nature Association, and the International Union for the Protection of Nature. Such citizen groups have not only helped with the establishment of each national park and monument, but have risen to their defense when they were threatened with encroachment, have counseled with committees of Congress, with the President, the Secretary of the Interior, and with the National Park Service on broad matters of policy that have made the national parks with its safeguard system what it is. Speaking of proper use of the national parks, Mr. Albright has said, "The enjoyment of a virgin forest, or a scenic view, or of wildlife, or a historical shrine, is use, just as much as is the cutting of trees for the lumber they produce." In these words, Mr. Albright underlined the Park Service view that parks are a national resource of a distinct character. Mines, timber, cattle, water, and soil yield material products required by the nation. Parks yield the products of knowledge, refreshment, and aesthetic enjoyment equally required by all the people. An ancient rule of warfare put into effect by Rome against Carthage was, if you wish to eliminate, destroy the center of activity, the home. Now the home of any wild creature is the community of which it is a part. You visitors alert to this fact will see that wildlife can be preserved only when proper protection is given to its necessary plant community. You can see that man-made modification of the national park scene destroys its capacity to yield needed refreshment. You are aware of the fact that preservation is not an end in itself, but a means to an end, which is inspirational enjoyment. The big question is, will we Americans, with our growing population, expanding communities, and business enterprises, retain the vision of protecting these sanctuaries needed for a true wilderness experience? Of course, sentiment must be adjusted to practicality. On one hand, there are the so-called purists, who prefer that the parks be preserved absolutely as they are, even if it means reducing public access to them. Conversely, there are those who believe that adjustments and compromises must be made in order to let more people use the park areas. In long chats with both groups, I have come to the conclusion that they are in agreement, fundamentally, in their desire to preserve as well as use the national treasures they love. Both can make strong cases, for the Act of 1916, establishing the national parks, said their purpose was to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects, and the wildlife therein, and to provide enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. Thus the question persists, how is it possible to permit an ever-increasing number of people to enjoy the parks and at the same time keep the parks unimpaired for succeeding generations? Each visitor to the national parks, realizing that the interpretation of original standards of preservation is still evolving, can decide for himself what should be done, and make his voice heard. After all, each one of us can rightfully have the feeling of part owner as we gaze upon the lacy wonder of Yosemite Falls dropping into rainbowed mists, or stand in the remarkable quiet of a grove of stately sequoias, and at another time peer into the blue mirror of Crater Lake. Ownership, of course, connotes responsibility. It carries the right to look around with the purpose of constructive criticism. Ravages of neglect in our parks are obvious. Sheep grazing has left scars on Mount Rainier. The bighorn have disappeared from the slopes of the High Sierra, from the deserts of Big Bend, and from the lofty heights of Mesa Verde. Rare bird life of the Everglades went to the millinery trade. The last grizzly bear in California was shot in Kings Canyon before the canyon was included in a national park. The buffalo and the trumpeter swan are now almost extinct. Elk have disappeared from Rocky Mountain and Glacier. Gone are the heath hen and the passenger pigeon from our forests. Burned over areas in Acadia and the man-made lake behind Hetch Hetchy Dam in Yosemite stand as reminders of man's carelessness and lack of sensitivity to priceless wilderness values. Today the threats, though changed in form, continue. Power interests clamor for dams in the parks to provide electric energy to turn the wheels of industry. Sheepmen press for grazing rights in some parks. Lumbermen look longingly upon vast stretches of virgin timber in the northwestern parks. Miners want to explore for minerals. Oil men still have their eye for possible exploration in the parks. By laws laid down, the Park Service can prohibit settlement, hunting and trapping, mining, lumbering, water storage projects, and other commercial activities. Where such activities are permitted, Congress has expressly provided for them. Encouragingly, the Park Service reports much progress in the solution of these problems. Commercial grazing of sheep, cattle, and horses is all but eliminated from the parks. New parks and monuments are being added, gradually, to preserve worthy areas. Acquisitions of inholdings or private land in the parks progresses. Progress is being made with new tools, including the use of helicopters and planes in the control of destructive fires. Public support is being consolidated in the defense against the building of dams for irrigation and power. Poaching in the parks is practically a thing of the past. Gradually, the restoration of native habitats, in which the predator has a recognized part, is taking place. Within this context of preservation, there is, of course, a place for necessary management measures to counteract adverse influences. Fires, even though useful in respect to removing pests and providing open spaces for certain kinds of trees, must be controlled. Insect manifestations of epidemic proportions have to be controlled. Exotic plants and animals must be eradicated as far as it is feasible and practicable to do so. At times, the populations of big animals have to be controlled within the parks to counteract the loss of winter range. Reduction of predators and other unnatural conditions created by the park's artificial boundaries also have to be effected. The important thing, as solutions are studied to allow maximum public enjoyment without impairment to the beautifully organized, dynamic communities of plants and animals in historic and scenic settings, is not to overlook this fact. Aggressive attempts are still numerous, well organized and powerfully supported to despoil the national parks. The majority of such attacks are dispelled by the National Park Service and the Department of the Interior before they become subjects of public controversy or congressional action. In some dramatic episodes, however, private citizens, numerous organizations, and congressional leaders have all pitched in to help. There have been a few reversals, but the history of the parks has been one of repeated victories in such matters. There are still remote areas where the hiker can lose himself from human habitation for days, for meditation and solitude. A few that come to mind include the backcountry trails of Glacier, Olympic, and Big Bend, Kings Canyon, Rainbow Bridge, Dinosaur, and many other Southwest monuments, and Mount McKinley and Katmai National Monument in Alaska. But such places grow fewer each year. Increased use by millions of visitors means holding the line of preservation with true wisdom. As guardians over the nation's parks, set aside for deeper purpose than mere recreation in the resort sense, the Park Service men in gray-green uniform are firmly rejecting the many requests to introduce inappropriate devices and activities. Thus, the trail winding ahead of you into the national parks promises more than pleasure for the visitor. It offers you the obligation that goes with an inheritance. Along with the delightful experience of getting in tune with the rhythm of nature, of watching the bears and climbing the mountains, you can perform a service by upholding the high standards of park protection, by supporting the efforts of the Park Service to keep out all intrusions that would detract from the priceless inspirational quality of the nation's scenic masterpieces and historic shrines. John Muir, that sturdy wanderer of the Sierras, said, "Climb the mountains and get their good tidings. Nature's peace will flow into you as sunshine flows into trees. The winds will blow their own freshness into you, and storms their energy, while cares will drop off like autumn leaves."